I didn't plan to come home early that day. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday. A quick stop at the office, a late lunch with clients, and then home. But fate, or maybe something else, pulled me off track. I remember the traffic being unbearable, the frustration bubbling as I pulled into my driveway earlier than expected. I didn't think much of it then, but as I walked up to the door, a strange unease gripped me. It wasn't the kind of feeling you shake off. It stuck to me like a warning I couldn't ignore. When I pushed the door open, the sound of hurried footsteps upstairs caught my attention immediately. My breath hitched and my mind raced. Why would Claire, my wife, be running like that? My first thought wasn't suspicion. No, I trusted her. Maybe she was rushing to answer the phone, or she had dropped something. That's what I told myself. But then I heard it, low voices. A man's voice. At first, I thought it was the TV, but as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, the voices grew clearer. Muffled laughter, whispered words. My stomach tightened, my pulse quickened, and yet I kept moving, as if I was being pulled by some force beyond my control. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the reflection in the mirror on the far wall. I froze. My hands, which had been steady moments ago, began to tremble. There she was, Claire. And with her was someone I didn't recognize at first. A younger man, shirtless, sitting too close, laughing in a way that wasn't innocent. I felt the air leave my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind scrambled for an explanation, anything that would make this scene make sense. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe I was overreacting. But as I stood there, paralyzed, I watched her reach for his hand. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. I pushed the door open, and the sound was enough to make them jump. Claire's face turned pale as she scrambled to explain, words tumbling out incoherently. The young man, Liam, stared at me, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. He wasn't even trying to defend himself. I didn't say a word. Not yet. I just stood there, taking in every detail, the guilt etched across Claire's face, the panic in Liam's eyes, the room that now felt like a stranger's space. My hands clenched into fists, but I kept my voice steady when I finally spoke. "This is what you've been doing?" My words cut through the silence like a blade. Claire stammered, trying to reach for me, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said, my tone sharper than I'd ever heard it before. Liam tried to gather his things, mumbling apologies that fell flat. I didn't stop him as he scurried out of the room, leaving behind an awkward silence that hung between Claire and me like a storm cloud. I didn't yell, didn't throw anything. I just looked at her, really looked at her. And in that moment, I saw someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had been hiding this side of herself for who knows how long. Without another word, I turned and walked out. My mind was racing, but one thought was louder than the rest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Before we continue, 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy this story and want to support us, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay updated. Also, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you are watching from. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. The quiet hum of the car engine was the only sound as my mind spiraled through a storm of memories, questions, and regrets. I wanted answers, needed them, but I wasn't ready to hear anything from her. Not yet. Instead, I found myself replaying moments from the past, searching for signs I might have missed. Claire and I met almost a decade ago at a mutual friend's wedding. She was vibrant, full of life, and had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. I remember watching her from across the reception hall, thinking she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. She caught me staring, smiled, and just like that, we were inseparable. I thought about our early days, late-night phone calls, road trips, inside jokes no one else understood. There was a time when she looked at me like I was her entire world, and I felt the same way. We built a life together. First the tiny apartment where we lived on takeout and laughter, then the modest house where we dreamed of starting a family. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The cracks started small, barely noticeable. A missed dinner here, a curt response there. I chalked it up to stress. Work was demanding, and life has a way of pulling people in different directions. But now, looking back, I could see it. The late nights she claimed were for meetings, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way her phone seemed to never leave her side. There was one moment, just a few months ago, that now stood out like a neon sign. We were sitting on the couch, her scrolling through her phone while I tried to talk to her about a trip I wanted to plan. She nodded along, but her eyes never left the screen. When I asked her what was so interesting, she gave me a half-hearted smile and said, "Just work stuff." At the time, I let it go. Why wouldn't I? I trusted her. But now, that moment felt like the turning point, the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming. I couldn't stop thinking about Liam. Who was he? What did he have that I didn't? Was this the first time, or had there been others? The questions gnawed at me, each one more painful than the last. I felt a wave of anger, not just at her, but at myself. How had I been so blind? The memories kept coming, unrelenting. Our anniversary last year. She'd been distant, distracted, and I'd convinced myself it was just a rough patch. The weekend trips with her friends that I never questioned. The way she seemed to light up when her phone buzzed, only to dim when she looked at me. For every good memory, there was now a shadow, a question mark that tainted what had once been pure. And yet, even in my anger, there was sadness. I'd built my life around her, trusted her completely, and in one moment, it all came crashing down. I pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I tried to make sense of what had happened. A part of me wanted to go back home, to demand answers, to confront her again. But another part of me, the part that felt broken and betrayed, couldn't bear to face her just yet. Instead, I sat there, staring out at nothing, letting the weight of it all sink in. The betrayal wasn't just about what she'd done. It was about what it meant. The life we'd built, the trust we'd shared. It was all a lie. Or at least, it felt that way. And then there was Liam. The thought of him made my blood boil. Who was he to walk into my life and take what wasn't his? What kind of man does that? My mind wandered to Sophie, the woman he'd betrayed as well. Did she know? Had she felt this same gut-wrenching pain? I reached for my phone, fingers hovering over the call button. I didn't know what I'd say to her, didn't even know if I should call her. But something told me she deserved to know. She deserved the truth, just like I did. For now, though, I stayed in that parking lot, letting the memories and emotions wash over me. The anger, the sadness, the disbelief. It all swirled together, overwhelming and all-consuming. I didn't know what my next move would be, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. The parking lot became my war room, a place where my thoughts finally started to focus. I pulled out my phone, staring at Claire's name in my contacts. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. What was I supposed to say? That I was shattered? That I'd never look at her the same way again? Words felt inadequate for what I was feeling. Instead, I scrolled further down and stopped at the name I'd just added hours earlier. Sophie, Liam's wife. I'd found her through a quick search on social media, her profile filled with pictures of her and Liam smiling like the perfect couple. Perfect. What a joke. I hesitated for a moment, then tapped her name and typed out a message. Hi, Sophie. My name is Ethan. I think we need to talk about your husband. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. A part of me felt guilty. Was I about to destroy someone's world just because mine had been wrecked? But the anger drowned out the guilt. She deserved to know. I pressed send before I could second-guess myself. The response came faster than I expected. Who is this? What are you talking about? I could feel the confusion in her words, the same confusion I'd felt just hours ago. I took a deep breath and began typing again. It's about Liam and my wife, Claire. I caught them together. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I thought you should know. There was no reply for a while, and I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe she wouldn't believe me. Maybe she'd block me and cling to whatever lies Liam fed her. But just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed. Where can we meet? Her response was short, direct. No denial, no disbelief, just a question that made my heart race. I replied with the name of a nearby cafe, and we agreed to meet in an hour. The time dragged as I sat in that parking lot, rehearsing what I would say. My thoughts were interrupted by memories of Claire, her laugh, her touch, the way she used to look at me. I wondered if she was sitting at home now, wondering where I was. Or maybe she was with Liam. The thought made my stomach churn. When I arrived at the cafe, Sophie was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked exactly like her pictures, petite, dark-haired, with a kind face that seemed out of place in the storm we were about to step into. Her eyes met mine as I walked in, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded and sat down across from her. "Sophie." She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me everything." I told her everything I knew, sparing no details. Her face went through a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, a sort of quiet resignation. She didn't cry, didn't yell. She just listened, her hands gripping her coffee cup so tightly that I thought it might shatter. "I knew something was off," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been distant lately, working late, taking calls in the other room." I wanted to believe him. I really did. Her words mirrored my own thoughts, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange sense of solidarity. We were two people blindsided by betrayal, strangers brought together by the lies of the people we loved. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking at me with a mix of desperation and determination. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the question settling over me. "I don't know about you," I said slowly, "but I'm not letting this slide." Sophie nodded, her jaw tightening. "Neither am I." What started as a conversation turned into a plan. Sophie shared more about Liam, their routines, his weaknesses, the secrets he thought she didn't know. I told her everything I'd learned about Claire, filling in the gaps of the puzzle we were both piecing together. The more we talked, the angrier we became, feeding off each other's resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control, about making sure they felt the pain they'd inflicted on us. By the time we left the cafe, we had a plan. It wasn't fully formed, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get started. We exchanged numbers and agreed to meet again soon. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't just reacting. I was taking action. But as I started the engine and drove away, a nagging thought crept into my mind. How far was I willing to go? The answer, I realized, was simple: as far as it takes. Those words echoed in my mind as I drove home that night. The plan Sophie and I had concocted was bold, maybe even reckless, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to sit quietly while Claire and Liam carried on as if their betrayal didn't matter. I didn't know what the outcome would look like, but I knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't forget what they'd done. The first step was simple enough: information. Sophie and I stayed in constant contact over the next few days, exchanging details, piecing together timelines, and figuring out just how long this had been going on. It turned out Liam wasn't as careful as he thought. Sophie found receipts for expensive dinners she'd never attended, photos on his phone he thought he deleted, and a second email account he used for work. I spent those nights in silence, going over every message, every photo. The rage I felt wasn't just about the affair itself. It was the brazenness of it. They had taken something sacred and turned it into a joke. Then, it was time to act. Sophie called me one evening, her voice steadier than I'd heard it before. "I have an idea," she said. Her plan was bold, almost theatrical, but I agreed without hesitation. A week later, I walked into the restaurant Claire and I used to call our favorite. It was the place where we celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, and all the milestones of a life we'd built together. Tonight, though, it was the site of something else entirely. I had arrived early, choosing a table that gave me a clear view of the entire room. Sophie joined me shortly after, her expression calm but determined. Together, we waited. Claire arrived first, wearing the red dress I'd always told her was my favorite. The sight of her made my chest tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't about nostalgia. This was about closure. Liam followed shortly after, his hand resting on the small of her back as they entered. They didn't see us at first, too wrapped up in each other to notice. When their eyes finally landed on us, the color drained from Claire's face. Liam froze mid-step, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "Ethan," Claire stammered. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood, my eyes locking onto hers. "Why don't you both sit down?" I said, gesturing to the empty seats across from us. Liam hesitated, glancing at Sophie, who was glaring at him with a cold intensity one hadn't seen before. Claire looked between us, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the chair. Once they were seated, the silence was suffocating. I let it hang for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle over them. Then, I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "You thought you could get away with this, didn't you?" I said, my eyes boring into Claire's. "You thought we'd never find out." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't. Just don't." Sophie took over then, pulling out her phone and placing it on the table. She tapped the screen, and suddenly, the sounds of their conversations, recordings she'd found on Liam's device, filled the space between us. Every word was a dagger, each laugh a fresh wound. Liam tried to interrupt, his voice rising in panic. "Sophie, stop. We can talk about this." But she wasn't having it. "Talk about what, Liam? The lies? The betrayal? Or how you've made me feel like an idiot for trusting you?" The restaurant staff began to take notice, whispering among themselves as the scene unfolded. I didn't care. Let them watch. Let everyone see what kind of people Claire and Liam really were. When the recordings ended, the silence was deafening. Claire was crying now, her head in her hands, while Liam stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. I stood, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket. "This," I said, placing it in front of Claire, "is a copy of the divorce papers. I've already signed them. You'll get the originals in the mail." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Ethan, please, we can fix this." I shook my head, my voice firm. "No, Claire, we can't." I turned to Sophie, who was still glaring at Liam. "Are you ready?" I asked her. She nodded, standing with me. Together, we walked out of the restaurant, leaving Claire and Liam to sit in the wreckage of what they'd done. Outside, the air felt lighter, freer. Sophie looked at me, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally moving forward. And I wasn't looking back. The next morning, the gravity of what had happened finally hit me. For weeks, I had been running on anger, pain, and a need for vengeance. Now, in the quiet of my house, our house, I was alone with my thoughts. The adrenaline had faded, and in its place was a strange hollowness, a void that no confrontation or plan could fill. I walked through the house slowly, each room a reminder of the life Claire and I had built together. The living room still had the throw blanket she insisted we buy, the one she always wrapped herself in on movie nights. The kitchen had the wine glasses we brought back from a trip to Italy, glasses we used to toast to anniversaries, birthdays, and just the fact that we had each other. Now, it all felt like a lie. The dining table, where we used to share meals and stories about our days, now felt like a battlefield where words had been exchanged that could never be taken back. I sat at the head of the table, staring at the empty seat across from me, and let the weight of it all settle in. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry, not out of anger, but out of grief, for the love that had been shattered, for the trust that had been destroyed, and for the version of myself that had believed in forever. Later that day, Claire called. I stared at the screen, her name flashing like a beacon of everything I wanted to avoid. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something inside me, maybe a need for closure, compelled me to answer. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Ethan, I just wanted to talk." "About what?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Everything," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything, but I need you to understand." I cut her off. "Understand what, Claire? That you threw away everything we had for, what? A fling? A thrill? Tell me, because I'm struggling to find a reason that makes sense." She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I didn't feel like myself anymore. I felt like I was fading into this version of me that I didn't recognize, and Liam. He made me feel seen. Her words stung more than I expected. It wasn't an excuse. It didn't absolve her of what she had done. But it made me see her in a way I hadn't before. Not as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone who was flawed, struggling, and human. I don't know what you want me to say, I said finally. I can't undo what happened. Neither can you. All I know is that I can't live like this, wondering if I'll ever be able to trust you again. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking, for everything. I hope you can forgive me someday. I didn't respond. Instead, I hung up, placing the phone on the table and staring at it as if it held the answers to questions I couldn't even articulate. In the days that followed, I began to rebuild, piece by piece. The house felt emptier without Claire, but it also felt lighter, freer. I started to focus on myself, going for long runs to clear my mind, reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in years, and throwing myself into work. Sophie and I stayed in touch, though less frequently as time passed. She filed for divorce from Liam, and from what I heard, it was a messy, drawn-out process. She seemed to be handling it with a strength I admired, though I knew the scars of betrayal ran deep for both of us. One evening, months later, I received a message from Sophie. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment before replying. "Better. You?" "Getting there," she wrote back. "We should grab coffee sometime." The idea caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about her in that way, not really, but there was something comforting about the connection we shared. Two people who had been broken by betrayal, trying to find their way forward. "Sure," I replied. "I'd like that." As the days turned into weeks, I found myself thinking less about Claire and Liam and more about what came next. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The pain hadn't disappeared. It probably never would, but it had started to fade, replaced by a quiet resilience that reminded me I was stronger than I'd thought. Life had knocked me down, but I was standing again, ready to face whatever came next. And this time, I wouldn't just survive. I would thrive. Those words became my mantra in the months that followed. Each day was a small step forward, but each step felt significant, like laying a single brick to rebuild something that had been reduced to rubble. I started focusing on things I'd let slip during my marriage, things that used to make me happy but had been put aside for the sake of us. Running was one of them. Every morning, just before sunrise, I'd lace up my shoes and hit the pavement, the cool air biting at my skin and the sound of my steps pounding against the ground. It became more than just exercise. It was a way to clear my mind, to remind myself of my own strength and resilience. Work, too, became an anchor. I threw myself into projects, not to escape, but to rediscover the drive I once had. My colleagues noticed the change. "You seem different," one of them said during a team meeting. "More focused, more alive." I smiled at that, realizing it was true. The fog of betrayal had started to lift, and with it, the version of me that had been buried under the weight of a failing marriage. But it wasn't just about work or hobbies. I also began to nurture the relationships I'd neglected over the years. Old friends who had once felt like family but had faded into the background as life got busy were suddenly back in my life. I reached out, made plans, and found comfort in the familiarity of those connections. Sophie and I met for that coffee, just as she'd suggested. It was a simple meeting, nothing dramatic. Two people sharing a table, talking about life. But there was something comforting in our shared experience, in knowing that someone else understood the complexities of moving forward after such a profound betrayal. "I'm thinking of moving out of the city," Sophie said at one point, stirring her coffee absently, "starting fresh somewhere new. What about you?" I thought about it for a moment. "I don't know. Maybe. But for now, I'm focused on building a life here that feels like mine again." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's a good place to start." As the weeks passed, our conversations became more frequent. Sometimes they were about the past, about the pain we were both still working through. Other times, they were about the future, dreams, goals, and the small joys we were rediscovering. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something deeper, a mutual understanding, a shared journey. One evening, I found myself sitting on my back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, and I saw Sophie's name light up the screen. "How's the view?" she asked when I answered. "Beautiful," I replied. There was a pause, comfortable and unspoken, before she said, "Ethan, do you think we'll ever completely move on from all of this?" I thought about her question, the weight of it, and then answered honestly. "I don't know, but I think we'll carry it with us in a way that makes us stronger. It won't define us, but it'll shape us." "Yeah," she said softly. "I think so too." As we talked, I realized how far I'd come, not just in healing from what Claire had done, but in understanding myself in a way I hadn't before. The man I was becoming wasn't defined by betrayal or anger. He was someone who had learned to let go, to forgive, not for anyone else's sake, but for his own. Months turned into a year, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. I sold the house, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because it was time for a change. I found a smaller place, one that felt like a blank slate, and filled it with things that made me happy. Claire reached out a few times, but the conversations were brief, polite. I didn't hate her anymore. In fact, I didn't feel much of anything when I thought about her. The love we'd shared had been real, but it was a chapter that had closed. As for Liam, I heard through the grapevine that his life had fallen apart. Sophie had left him, and he was struggling to piece things back together. Part of me felt satisfaction in that, but another part, the part that had grown, that had moved on, felt pity. Sophie and I continued to see each other, slowly, cautiously. It wasn't the kind of whirlwind romance you read about in novels. It was quiet, steady, and built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. We didn't rush anything. We didn't have to. One day, as we walked through a park on a crisp autumn afternoon, she turned to me and said, "You know, I think we're going to be okay." I smiled at her, the weight of the past finally lifting in a way I hadn't thought possible. "Yeah," I said, "I think we are." The future wasn't certain, and I didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. Life was messy, unpredictable, and full of twists I couldn't control. But it was also beautiful, and I was ready to embrace it. Every moment, every challenge, every new beginning. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living.